young people vanishing in the woods around the abandoned asylum, a wax dummy hanging in a carnival funhouse that turned out to be an actual corpse, a woman in Chicago attacked by something crawling out of her window, hidden bodies under hotel beds, a creepy doll collector, and more. These sound like urban legends, but they turned out to be terrifyingly real. For those who grew up in Staten Island, the story of Cropsey was a pretty common campfire tale. He was a boogeyman with a hook for a hand who'd supposedly escaped from an asylum and lived in the old abandoned tunnels beneath the Willowbrook State School, waiting to snatch kids who wandered too far. Most people thought it was just a way to keep kids from playing in the woods, but in the 70s and 80s, children actually started vanishing. The monster turned out to be a man named Andre Rand. He wasn't a supernatural entity, he was worse, a real man. He was a former janitor at Willowbrook who stayed on the grounds after the school was shut down. He was living in a makeshift campsite right in the middle of those woods. In 1987, a search party finally found the remains of a young girl buried just a few yards from where Rand was living. Turned out he really was using that tunnel system from the legends to move around the island undetected. The hook hand, that was made up, but the man living in the ruins of an asylum was terrifyingly real. There's an old story that sometimes the props you see in carnival haunted houses, either skeletons or mummies hanging from the ceilings, aren't actually made of plastic or wax. The rumor was that some cash-strapped carnivals used real human remains because they were cheaper than professional props back in the day. Well, in 1976, a camera crew was filming at a funhouse in Long Beach, California. They tried to move a wax mannequin that was hanging from a noose, and when the arm snapped off, they saw actual human bone. It wasn't a prop. It was the body of Elmer McCurdy, an outlaw who died in a 1911 shootout. Because no one claimed him, an undertaker mummified him and started renting him out to carnivals. And for 60 years, his body was passed around from sideshows to wax museums, with owners eventually forgetting the mummy had actually been a real person. By the time he was found, he'd been covered in neon orange paint. He was finally given a proper burial in Oklahoma with a massive block of concrete poured over his casket to make sure he'd never become a prop again. For decades, people in western Pennsylvania told stories about the Green Man or Charlie No Face. The legend went that a glowing, faceless man haunted a specific railroad tunnel at night. It was said that he was radioactive or electrical, and if you got too close, he'd stall your car engine. The legend was actually based on a real man named Raymond Robinson. When he was 9, he was severely disfigured in a massive electrical accident that cost him his nose, his eyes, and one of his arms. Raymond was actually said to be a very kind-hearted guy, but he only felt comfortable going out for walks in the middle of the night. He didn't want to frighten people with his appearance, and he did not want the attention. But teens would drive out specifically to try and spot him after stories started to spread. In reality, the glow people reported was just the reflection of their own headlights off his skin. He wasn't a monster at all. He was just a guy who'd survived a tragedy and wanted to enjoy the night air and peace. Passed away in 1985. This next one's a pretty common trope, finding a dead body under a mattress. A couple checks into a hotel, notices a nasty odor in the room, and complains to the staff. Staff come to check, but the room seems fine. Well, after a night of sleeping on the bed, they finally lift the mattress to find a decomposing body hidden inside the bed frame. Sounds like a horror movie scene, but it actually has happened dozens of times. There have been cases in cities like Las Vegas and Atlantic City, and in one 1999 case in Colorado Springs, a couple actually slept on a bed for 3 nights. They'd noticed an off smell though, and the hotel staff had been trying to cover it up with air freshener. When the staff finally checked, they found that the wooden base of the bed had been hollowed out to hide the body of a woman who'd been missing for over a week. And again, that's just one example. There are tons of horror stories like this. Criminals had frequently used this tactic because they know hotel staff rarely lift the heavy mattresses during a standard cleaning. It's the reason most modern hotels have switched to solid platform beds. Anyway, moral of the story, trust your nose. Also, don't kill people and hide them in hotel beds, but I think that's obvious. We're all familiar with the ghost stories surrounding mirrors, mainly Bloody Mary. The 1992 movie Candyman also played with this idea. There's actually a real case that was the direct inspiration for the movie. It happened in a Chicago housing project in 1987. A woman named Ruthie Mae McCoy called the police, terrified because someone was trying to come through her medicine cabinet. It sounded pretty far-fetched, obviously. Ruthie also had a bit of a history of paranoia, so when the officers didn't find any signs of a break-in at the front door, they left. Well, a few days later, she was found dead. The investigation revealed there was a massive flaw in these apartments. The medicine cabinets in those buildings were built back to back, so all anyone needed to do was unscrew their cabinet and they could climb through the wall and step right into their neighbor's bathroom. People had been using these mirror doors to move between apartments and commit robberies, and worse, for months. For 27 years, people living around North Pond, Maine told stories about a mountain man or a ghost that lived in the woods. He was blamed for thousands of tiny thefts, food, batteries, and propane, but he was never seen, never left footprints, and seemed to vanish into thin air. A lot of people thought he was just a myth, but in 2013, the so-called ghost was finally caught on a trail camera. His name was Christopher Knight. He'd walked in the woods in 1986 at the age of 20 and stayed there for nearly 3 decades without ever talking to another human being. He lived in a tiny camouflaged tent site just a few hundred yards from the cabins that he was raiding. He survived the freezing Maine winters by wrapping himself in stolen sleeping bags and never lighting a fire because he knew the smoke would give him away. He wasn't some ghostly entity, but there really was a guy living right in people's backyards for 27 years without anyone ever seeing his face. In 1983, the video game industry crashed so hard that Atari was stuck with millions of copies of the E.T. game, which was considered the worst game ever made. Legend said that to hide their shame and the massive financial loss, they drove a fleet of trucks into the New Mexico desert in the middle of the night and buried the games in a secret mass grave under a layer of concrete. It's a pretty ridiculous story. Unfortunately, real life is not a sitcom, so this has to be a tall tale, or at best an exaggeration, right? For 30 years, that's what people thought. But in 2014, a documentary crew got permission to dig up an old landfill in Alamogordo. After hours of digging, they hit a layer of crushed plastic and cardboard and started pulling out hundreds of intact ET cartridges. The graveyard was real. Atari had been so overwhelmed by retailers returning the games that they literally could not store them all, so they decided to just bury their shame. In the 1940s, a phantom was said to be stalking a small town in Illinois. Legend described a tall, thin man in dark clothes who would spray a sweet-smelling gas through open bedroom windows, leaving his victims paralyzed and nauseated before vanishing into the night. This started in September 1944, and the panic was so intense that the town of Mattoon was put under armed patrol. A lot of people dismiss this story as mass hysteria caused by the stress of the war, but there were physical details that didn't really fit that theory. Some victims had real symptoms like swollen lips and chemical burns, and police found window screens that had been cut on the outside. Whether it was actually an attacker with knowledge of chemistry or maybe a leak from a nearby plant, there's definitely some truth to the Mad Gasser story. And, let's be real, compared to most urban legends, this one really isn't that far-fetched. There's a common horror trope about an eccentric man who lives alone in a house filled with life-size dolls. The legend says he treats them like they're alive, but the neighbors swear that the dolls look too realistic, almost like they're made of real skin. In 2011, a case unraveled that has to be one of the creepiest in Russia. Anatoly Moskvin was a seemingly regular guy. Actually, he was a brilliant historian, a successful, learned man. So when police found out that a series of grave robberies led back to him, they were pretty surprised. And that shock turned to total revulsion when they entered his apartment to find 29 life-size dolls dressed in stockings and dresses. They weren't actually dolls, though. Moskvin had spent years digging up the remains of young girls from local cemeteries. He'd mummified them using salt and baking soda, stuffed them with padding, and even installed music boxes inside their chests so they would sing when he touched them. Gave them all names and threw birthday parties for them, treated them like they were alive. One of the creepiest stories I've ever heard, I think. This is one of the oldest fears in the world, that someone could be mistakenly declared dead, buried, and then wake up in total darkness, clawing at the inside of their coffin. One of my biggest fears, I think. That's why I don't want to be buried in a coffin at all. Send my body out into space. Just let me drift into a black hole or something. Sounds doable. Anyway, the legend says that when old cemeteries are moved, workers sometimes find scratch marks on the inside of the lids. Well, in the 19th century, this was actually a very real risk. Before modern technology, doctors sometimes had a hard time telling the difference between a deep coma and death. This fear was so common that people invented safety coffins with bells and air tubes. One documented case from 1891 involves a woman named Octavia Hatcher. She was buried but wasn't actually dead. She'd just been unresponsive. She'd suffered some sort of mysterious sleeping sickness. Basically, she was in a coma. Well, when several other people in the town caught the same sleeping sickness and eventually woke up, her husband was like, oh my god, and he had her exhumed. When they opened the coffin, they found the inner lining shredded and Octavia's fingernails raw from her frantically trying to crawl her way out. Terrifying indeed. All that said, I've been your host James, and I will catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.